looking at some of the changing trends in the management of achalasia cardia. And the most important question is, why are the trends changing? I mean, we have a system in place. We have all these treatment modalities. Why do we need the change? So the one thing that is important is there is increased incidence, but that is more related to the increased awareness among both the patients and clinicians. That was previously not there so much because a lot of these cases were mislabeled as reflux, as plain old acidity, and a lot of achalasia cases were missed. So the increasing incidence is probably because of increasing diagnosis. Secondly, we have improved diagnosis, not just increasing diagnosis, they have improved diagnosis. We have endoscopy assisted techniques, we have high resolution manometry. So all of these have given us a more deeper insight into the entity of achalasia and better ways to diagnose it. Like I said, now we better understand the disease. Newer classification systems have come up, and now we can differentiate achalasia from other motility disorders. Now we have the Chicago classification, which has differentiated achalasia and classified achalasia, and we have now differentiated it from other types of motility disorders like diffuse esophageal spasm and nutcracker esophagus and all those things. And lastly, especially use of the minimally invasive techniques, laparoscopy, thoracoscopy, these have led to improved outcomes. Surgical treatment in the past for achalasia carried a very high morbidity. Now, with minimally invasive techniques and onset of endoscopic treatment techniques, the outcomes have improved a lot. So, the key to patient satisfaction in achalasia is to diagnose and classify the disease accurately. Unless and until you do that, the symptoms are not going to go away, the diagnosis and treatment is not going to be accurate, and the patient is, of course, not going to be satisfied. So, the preliminary do's and don'ts of achalasia diagnosis are: number one, you suspect achalasia cardia when the patient presents to you with a non-progressive dysphagia. That is usually long-standing, patient has had it for years together, along with a little bit of retrosternal pain, regurgitation, and the patient often says that he has to drink a glass of water to flush the bolus down, or he has to take a walk for 2 to 3 minutes so that the bolus goes down. That sense of food sticking to the esophagus, food sticking to the food pipe, is very characteristic of achalasia. Now, when we have certain symptoms that go beyond these characteristic symptoms, these are the alarm signs. They include significant weight loss, progressive dysphagia that has been increasing over the last few months, onset of hematemesis, loss of appetite, and presence of cervical lymphadenopathy. These are signs that should not be missed because they are not characteristic for achalasia. Now, a lot of these patients receive a lot of misplaced therapy, PPIs, antacids, prokinetics, protein supplements, vitamin supplements. It is best to bear in mind that none of these will work on achalasia. This is just some kind of placebo that is being prescribed. And when you suspect achalasia, when you suspect a motility disorder, the dilemma is whether to go for endoscopy or whether to go for imaging. So it is important to know that both modalities have their specific role. So you will have to do both, and it is best that you refer the patient early to a gastroenterology center, which has both medical and surgical gastroenterology facilities available, so that the patient can undergo a protocolized investigation algorithm. And it is best to counsel these patients that what they have is not just acidity and reflux. So these few do's and don'ts are very important for clinicians who are the first point of contact for the patients, because you cannot miss the alarm symptoms, you cannot keep treating patients with placebo therapies and so on. Now, What is achalasia? Achalasia in Greek means failure to relax. So, in essence, the lower esophageal sphincter fails to relax after a bolus enters the upper esophageal or the upper esophagus. Now, the esophagus has the neuromyotic plexus, which relaxes the lower esophageal sphincter as soon as a bolus enters the upper esophagus. Now, in achalasia, this neuromyotic plexus is degenerated. So, the esophagus fails to relax. So, this creates what we call a esophagogastric junction outlet obstruction. And that is what is measured using the manometry. Now, manometry classically was done as a conventional manometry using electrodes at every 4 to 5 centimeters along the lower esophagus. Now we have the high resolution manometry, which has narrower electrodes that are placed close by and all along 360-degree circumference of the lower esophagus. So the advantages with high resolution manometry are that the pressure measurements are at shorter intervals. So they are more accurate. The image that is given by the manometer is a topographic image representation instead of a waveform. So it is easier to interpret. Thirdly, it of course has a better image quality, and the narrower electrodes provide shorter spaced information about the LES pressure. So the characterization of the disease is more accurate with high resolution manometry. Plus, it has less interference due to swallowing and breathing movements as compared to the conventional manometry. So conventional manometry as of now is obsolete. We all go for high resolution manometry. Now, based on high resolution manometry, the Chicago classification has given us the classification of all these different motility disorders. And for the purpose of this talk, what is important to us is the achalasia part. The disorders of outflow obstruction include achalasia and incompletely expressed achalasia. So to diagnose achalasia, your integrated relaxation pressure or IRP needs to be more than the upper limit for normal. So the upper limit of the esophageal pressure is around 26 to 28 millimeters of mercury. The IRP needs to be more than that. Plus, the peristalsis needs to be absent, or there needs to be a non-peristaltic contraction that is called a spasm. So based on this, achalasia is classified into these three types that we'll see further how it is classified. Okay. Now, type 1 is incomplete LES relaxation. There is complete absence of any peristaltic movement, plus there is absence of any esophageal pressurization. Now, when we mean pressurization, it means that the entire esophageal muscle, it contracts as a unit and not as a wave. So it creates a pressure within the lumen that is not transmitted and that does not transmit the food bolus ahead. So this is called pan-esophageal pressurization. So in type 1, there is no pan-esophageal pressurization. In type 2, you have pan-esophageal pressurization with at least 20% of the swallows. And in type 3, you have premature contractions. So the distal latency period is less than 4.5 seconds, which means that there is a sort of a reversed peristalsis, meaning that once the esophagus distends, the upper esophagus distends due to the bolus, the lower esophagus, not just the lower esophageal sphincter, the lower esophagus contracts. So a premature contraction of the lower esophagus is triggered by the upper esophageal dilatation. So the distal latency is less than 4.5 seconds. So that constitutes type 3 achalasia. Now, apart from manometry, uh, timed barium esophagogram is an important investigation that is done. We all deride barium swallow that's an obsolete investigation. But as far as achalasia is concerned, a barium swallow or more specifically a timed barium esophagogram can give you a diagnosis of achalasia and related motility disorders so that you can then guide your manometry. So a few findings that are seen in a chest X-ray, in a esophagogram are listed here. You can have a air fluid level in the chest X-ray. You'll have a dilated esophagus. Barium retention is an important feature that is seen on a timed barium esophagogram. So the barium column height is measured from the lower esophagus, lower esophageal sphincter, and a height more than 5 centimeters at 1 minute and height more than 2 centimeters at 5 minutes is practically diagnostic of achalasia. In addition to that, you can have a bird beak appearance at the lower end that is shown with this arrow. On endoscopy, you can have retained food particles. You can have puckering that is seen at the gastroesophageal junction. And of course, there is resistance to gastric intubation. But to be fair, this resistance to gastric intubation is a subjective finding and is not diagnostic of achalasia. So there is an entity called as pseudoachalasia. So when there is a lot of resistance to intubation, you must always suspect that there is something else going on. So if a patient has age above 55 years, if the duration of symptoms is less than 1 year, it's a recent onset of symptoms, the weight loss is more than 10 kg, the dysphagia is progressive, these are the features that should prompt further evaluation with CT or endoscopic ultrasound to rule out what we call pseudoachalasia. Pseudoachalasia is presence of achalasia-like symptoms due to a mass or tumor that is present lower down the esophagus or at the GE junction. Now, there are multiple tumors that present as pseudoachalasia, and they include gastric tumors, lung tumors, esophageal tumors, lymphomas, and even prostatic tumors metastasizing to the mediastinum. So this entity, you must always beware that if these symptoms are present, you should evaluate these patients with CT or endoscopic ultrasound. Now, these are the routine management options for achalasia. You have the medical management that is practically not used in most patients. You have endoscopic interventions and you have surgical interventions. In surgical interventions, we have the open techniques, the laparoscopic techniques, and finally you have esophagectomy. So for purpose of more than 99% of patients, what is important is the laparoscopic myotomy, POEM, and esophagectomy, because most patients will receive one of these three therapies during the course of their disease. So the older guidelines, they used to classify achalasia patients into low surgical risk and high surgical risk. Low surgical risk patients used to have pneumatic dilatation or a cardiomyotomy, and failure of each was an indication to go for the other technique. Pneumatic dilatation was done with a grading of 30 millimeters, 35 millimeters, and 40 millimeters. Cardiomyotomy, if it failed, then the next option was to go to a pneumatic dilatation or a repeat myotomy or an esophagectomy. High risk patients received botulinum toxin injections, and failing that, they were put on a maintenance therapy with nitrates and calcium channel blockers. So this was an older algorithm that was used. Now, with onset of better diagnostic techniques and better therapeutic techniques, we have newer treatment modalities coming in. So, as far as type 2 and type 3 achalasia is concerned, these are the most important types because because they are more common than type 1 now, and two, it is the treatment modalities in these two types that change. In type 2 achalasia, practically anything that you do will have a good outcome. And in type 3 achalasia, practically anything you do will have a worse outcome. So it is important to classify achalasia into the types so that the treatment modality can be accordingly decided. Now, as you can see, this is a pictographical representation. This is the dilated esophagus, and this is the LES zone, the high pressure zone that that has a small diameter that causes the esophageal dilatation. Now, when you do a laparoscopic Heller's myotomy, The cardiomyotomy should extend along the esophagus, across the LES, and onto the cardia. So to show the intraoperative photo of this, as you can see, the length of myotomy is roughly 8 to 9 centimeters. It is around 5 to 6 centimeters on the esophagus and around 2.5 centimeters on the cardia of the stomach. So the critical points to remember when doing a laparoscopic myotomy is to have an adequate length of intra-abdominal esophagus. You have to open the crura, you have to obtain an adequate length of the intra-abdominal esophagus so that the myotomy can go at least 5 to 5.5 centimeters above the lower esophageal sphincter. You have to identify the GE junction, and like I said, a complete proximal and distal myotomy is necessary. You have to create a partial fundoplication. Uh, Floppy niscence is the most commonly performed fundoplication in these patients. And 31% of patients experience reflux symptoms if you only do myotomy, because essentially it is leading to a loss of the sphincter function. So if you do only a myotomy, 31% of patients will have reflux symptoms. If you add a fundoplication, only 9% will have a fundoplication. So it is important to add fundoplication to your cardiomyotomy. Now, the new technique that has come in over the last 10 years or so is POEM, Peroral Endoscopic Myotomy. The technique of it is that you endoscopically you create a submucosal tunnel in the esophagus. The submucosal tunnel goes beyond the GE junction onto the cardia. You divide the circular muscle bundles and you completely divide the circular muscle and you close the mucosal entry with clips. So as easy as it sounds, it is not that easy to do and has a learning curve of around 120 procedures to reduce the morbidity rate. The advantages are there is no abdominal incision, the recovery is much quicker, it has the option of avoiding general anesthesia. The myotomy in POEM is substantially longer as compared to a Heller's myotomy, that is a surgical myotomy. The median length of myotomy in a POEM is 16 centimeter as compared to 9 centimeter in the surgical myotomy. It also avoids vagal injury. And plus, since it's an endoscopic procedure, there are no intra-abdominal adhesions. But like the advantages, it also comes with a few limitations. The reflux is phenomenally high. It does have a serious risk of perforation, pneumothorax, bleeding, and mediastinitis. Now, all the others, of course, are much rarer side effects, but the reflux is much higher. In fact, the presence of GERD symptoms is 1.69 times more than that in Heller's myotomy, but that is just symptomatic GERD. If you look for endoscopic signs of reflux, it is nearly 10 times more than a surgical myotomy. So preventing reflux is a big headache for peroral endoscopic myotomy patients, and these patients are often lifelong on anti-reflux medications. So now with the newer techniques coming in, the treatment protocol has slightly been modified. Now with type 1 achalasia, pneumatic dilatation, surgical myotomy, and POEM, all three have nearly similar outcomes. And failure of myotomy, you can go ahead with repeat myotomy or an esophagectomy. With type 2 achalasia, the treatment of choice is now POEM. And failing that, or if POEM is not available, then a myotomy is done. With type 3 achalasia, since the outcomes are poor with all therapies, it is POEM that is still the treatment of choice. But here, pneumatic dilatation also has a role, since failure to resolve symptoms after pneumatic dilatation can always be treated by a repeat myotomy. So pneumatic dilatation as of now has no role in type 2 because POEM and myotomy both have excellent outcomes. Now, how do you assess the response to treatment after achalasia? So we have the Eckhart score, where weight loss, dysphagia, retrosternal pain, and regurgitation. These are the 4 parameters that are measured. And accordingly, you have the clinical stages where you classify patients' symptoms after treatment into one of these four stages. And if stage 2 and 3 are reached, then you deem the patient as a treatment failure. So the patient needs to have regurgitation, patient needs to have retrosternal pain along with weight loss for a higher score. Now, what do you do after myotomy failure? So if there is dysphagia after surgical myotomy, then you confirm the clinical diagnosis. The surgical myotomy is less than 3 months old, then you can still do a repeat myotomy. If the myotomy is more than 3 months old, then you can either go for a pneumatic dilatation, or if that also fails, you can go for POEM or repeat myotomy. And the last stage is, of course, esophageal replacement. So persistent or recurrent dysphagia, these are the few causes, and a tight fundoplication is one of the most ignored causes of recurrent dysphagia. That is why it is essential to have a floppy Nissen fundoplication after you do a surgical myotomy. After POEM, it is the reflux esophagitis and a post-treatment scarring that usually cause recurrent dysphagia. And since for a surgical myotomy, we dilate the crura, the crural opening, a paraesophageal hernia, and a herniation of the fundoplication into the mediastinum are important causes of persistent or recurrent dysphagia. So when do you do an esophagectomy? Now, when you have a failure of myotomy, you have a megaesophagus that is more than 6 centimeters in diameter, or you have a sigmoid esophagus, also called as an end-stage esophagus, which is dilated tortuous esophagus, and a suspicious of proven malignancy. These are the indications that this patient will need esophagectomy and not just a surgical myotomy. So the message here is that diagnosis and classification of the achalasia is the key for better outcomes. You have a patient, you refer the patient early to a specialist. Like I said, medical and surgical gastroenterology services must be present because multimodality treatment is the key to treat achalasia. Manometry, as we said, is the cornerstone of diagnosis. There is specific role of endoscopy in diagnosis as well as in therapy now. And we have multiple minimally invasive treatment options that are coming up, which have improved the outcome and reduced the length of stay and the morbidity, but at a cost of rising reflux in these patients. You can repeat POEM up to 3 times. I mean, POEM has been repeated up to 3 times.
Okay.
And the more you repeat, the worse the outcomes become because of esophageal scarring and loss of the sphincter function. So there is increase in reflux. And a majority of patients who require repeat POEM are type 3 achalasia patients. So there is a 93% chance that a patient who requires a second POEM will also require a third POEM. This is a 2020 meta-analysis on POEM that says that 93% of patients who require second POEM require a third POEM. Okay, so if a patient requires 2 episodes of POEM, it is better to offer them a surgical myotomy.
Has type of fundoplication has a lot of implications in the type of esophageal motility which is present. If the motility is disturbed, definitely nascence will cause a lot of dysphagia in the postoperative period. So here the primary esophageal motility is hampered in achalasia. So I don't understand how floppy nascence will help in this in reducing dysphagia also. I think they should have more dysphagia as compared to toupee and door.
Can I comment?
Yes, sir, please.
Yeah, I think Prasad, as you said, that more and more surgeons are now competent in doing a Nissen. I personally feel that there is an enthusiasm for Nissen as compared to toupee or door is more because the anti-reflux mechanism by the Nissen is better.
The base of the appendix is here.
That is one. And if you do a floppy, then probably the incidence of dysphagia or gas bloat will be much lesser.
Yeah, exactly. So Rajvilas, to answer your question, listen to me. So it can either be reflux or it can be a tight fundoplication, which is why a floppiness serves both purposes. It reduces the reflux while reducing the tightness of a classical Nissen's. And like I said, the outcomes with doors or toupees or of floppy Nissen are nearly similar. It is just that now with the learning curve, people are more comfortable with Nissens, and that is why you are seeing more and more patients with a Nissens, floppy Nissens after a cardiomyotomy.
Technically speaking, I think posterior toupee will be even easier to do than this one. Because in posterior toupee, you don't need to mobilize fundus that much. One. Secondly, it is easier to suture the esophageal walls than to cover the esophagus completely and make it floppy so that dysphagia risk reduces a lot. Third advantage of toupee can give is it can keep the myotomy lips quite apart, and which are normally kept by the stomach, and hence the reverse fibrosis causing obliteration of this myotomized area reduces. I mean, this was we used to posterior toupee. That was the choice usually used to do. And when there used to be esophageal perforation, during myotomy to open the mucosa, we used to add an anterior dose fundoplication. We used to close the mucosa, do a myotomy, and add an anterior 180-degree dose fundoplication for that. So never had a post-operative dysphagia.